Hey everyone. So I am here with Alex, and we are doing, from as far as I can remember, the first ever Dreams Around the World like ENFP experience interview, let's say, about a specific career or job, life path, and how that is. And Alex has a lot to say, and I'm very impressed, is very well prepared as well. Not to say some ENFPs don't come prepared or don't think about being concise, but it was awesome to see that. Do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, Alex?
Yeah, so I am right now a fifth year PhD student, and my specific topic of focus is I take antibody drugs and generic antibody drugs. They're called biosimilars if you want to look into it, and generic peptide drugs. And I stress them to harsh and stressful conditions, and then use analytical techniques to see how they degrade, how they come together, and how they change over like a course of incubation, for example.
And what's the overall outcome you're looking for with that kind of work? Like,
So
what are the
yeah,
goals you work towards?
the overall goal of what we're working on is to be able to shed light on drugs that are coming out to market. And so usually you have the big pharmaceutical company that creates a drug, and then the innovator, which is the first one of its type to come out that has the long patent protection. That one, there's very little details about how that degrades or how that changes over time. And so what we're trying to do is elucidate on that information. So when people are developing generic drugs to that we can try to understand some of the concepts that might involve, like, do you want to add certain excipients, which are the things that don't have an active effect, and whether that changes, say, the stability of that drug molecule.
So I don't know a lot about this area, but I think a lot of people, or at least I used to, assume that generic drugs were just identical. Like the brand you buy, it's the exact same thing. But I've heard from different sources that the generics often aren't as effective, or sometimes can be more effective, or just are different. So it's not as easy as clearly as just like copying the existing drug. There's a lot to getting it to how it is accepted by the body, let's say.
Yeah. So in short, when it comes to small molecules like your aspirins of the world, they're so simple in their chemical structure that the short of it is that when it comes to small molecules, you don't have to worry at all. It only comes to these big, they're called biologics, which come from like a cell source. And so the generics to these, like for example, the FDA in the United States, there's a term called interchangeable, but no one has ever achieved interchangeable because you have so much variation when you try to create drugs from cells or a living organism versus chemically synthesizing a small molecule.
Okay. Very interesting. So I imagine that some people out there talking about the big pharma conspiracies, why there isn't a generic for this. There's more to it than, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
and it gets deep into the patent. There's a lot of patent information of patent extensions as well. The topic is pretty broad in nature.
uh, I want to focus a lot on your experience doing your PhD and in this world of both academia and the sciences. But maybe to start off, why did you go down this route?
So the reason why I went down this route was because when I was an undergrad, mostly, I guess it was more out of circumstances. And I don't know if this is an ENFP happy-go-lucky sort of thing, but it was just the most obvious path, or the path of least resistance, was in front of me. So when I got into undergrad at my university, I happened to meet a professor that was doing pharmaceutical studies at the university. And so I worked for him in all 4 years of undergraduate. I worked for different professors. And then senior year of undergraduate, I met my current professor, and then I worked for her for a year. And then I said, hey, what if I joined the PhD program working for you for the entire length of the PhD, right? So I would say that me becoming a PhD is more out of happenstance, as I would see it, more than me making an actual decision of what I want to do with my life. But the more I come to, like, the more I've gotten into this PhD, the more I've questioned is like, is lab science is something I want to do? Is it something that fits my personality? Or do I need to make a pivot once I graduate and have the necessary information to get into something else, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned you just discovered the whole MBTI world and that you're an ENFP maybe 3 months ago or so.
Yeah. So I found it 3 months ago. The situation was I was in the last month of my internship in a big pharmaceutical company. I had a final presentation coming up where I traveled to their headquarters and gave it in front of all the potential, they're called research advisors, which are like the hiring managers. And so it was this big pressure situation, the compilation of 6 months of work. And when I get super stressed out, there's usually two things that I do fall back onto. One of them is as self-questioning and being like, is this really what I want to do with my life? I was sitting in lab, actually. It was about 7 o'clock at night. I was trying to wrap up a series of lab experiments, which actually resulted in nothing useful or conclusive at all, which is lab science at its finest, in my opinion. And so I ended up finding MBTI, the 16 personalities website, and I ended up taking the test, and it turned out I was an ENFP. And then I went down your typical hyper-focused rabbit hole. So I come out of it 3 hours later, I'm like, I've just spent 3 hours like going down this rabbit hole of trying to figure out what the heck this MBTI thing is. And looking through Reddit and all this such. And then all of a sudden I come to this thought of, if an ENFP has done a PhD in data in lab sciences, then someone must have written about it online. And so I Googled it and I couldn't find anything. I'm like, this is kind of odd, isn't it? Right?
Yeah. It's one of the things I really love about like learning your type and everything is you can get, I think, a lot better advice from people with at least a similar personality to you. Because I do think, not to go down another rabbit hole, but I do think there are probably different types of ENFPs. Like we could really break it down into 200 personalities, not 16 or something. Like I mentioned how impressed I was that you're like, I've prepared these notes and I'm going to be concise. And I was like, okay, that was my one worry about interviewing ENFPs. It's like 6 hours later, I've missed dinner. But yeah, it's nice to find someone who's done what you want to do or is going or has an experience. And that's why when you reached out to me about there not being content on it, I said, we should make some.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with what you say about finding someone who has a similar personality type, because I don't know if I've ever met anyone I would consider an ENFP. And so you can ask, there's two things that I learned. One thing is that if you can't find another person with your personality type, because once you find MBTI, you realize everyone's different. Everyone has a different personality. And so you could ask people how they do things, but at this point, if they're not your personality, then how likely is it to work, the advice that they give you? And then second of all, you realize, and this is an ENFP thing, I'm assuming, is that you just ask to get their advice because you want them on your side, so you connect with them personally, even though you know that it might not be the most applicable thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. And certain areas and industries definitely skew to one type or the other. I had a client who was an ENFP and was working high up in the banking sector. And she said everyone she worked with is ENTJs, like across the board, because who are the people who are drawn to kind of a position of significance and stability and financial success? It's kind of makes sense that it would end up. And so you do, like, I would guess you have met some ENFPs at some point, but it wouldn't be that surprising if you haven't met that many, if you've been in the sciences for this long, at least, since you finished high school or that you probably are surrounded by 2 or 3 personality types that are like 95% of people.
Yeah. Well, I find myself more with ENFJs, and then what's the defender personality type? There's a defender, the one called the defender. That's the one that I find the most. They're the easygoing. The professor comes and says, do this, no matter how much they don't want to do it, they'll do it anyways, and everything is organized. And I actually don't think I found an ENFP in the PhD yet, but that's because I'd say that's more a result of the first couple of years. I kind of locked myself into this box, which is why I probably came up with this notes of I've kind of gained some of the skills of an introvert in terms of organization, but that's out of necessity. But I haven't been taking advantage of conferences as much and going out and being like interacting with people. And now I'm like, I completely should have been doing that. Right.
Well, that's always the challenge, maybe the internal debate we have is because we can be very adaptable and we can figure out to make things work. Generally are pretty smart. Obviously you're doing your PhD, you're not a dumb guy. So if you're smart and adaptable, you can make things work where you can sort of force it or develop the skill. Yeah. And then we have moments where we're just totally in our element and it's so easy. And it's like, oh, wow, okay, what if every hour was like that or every day was like that?
Yeah. When you realize, because at my internship, I realized my favorite part were the meetings. And all these people are like, meetings are a waste of time. And I go, well, those are my favorite part. I'm like, oh, does no one else feel that way? Nope.
Yep. And, we've got to take, there is some element where we have to do the things we don't like to do. Just the reality of at least a lot of positions in the world, right? You have to adapt a bit, but maybe that's somewhere we can get into a bit is what have you found? And I don't know if you want to differentiate between just academia as a whole, which I don't know, when I imagine if I've sinned a lot in my life and were to end up in hell, I imagine some kind of academia. Undergrad was fun. There was a lot of parties and things like that. But if you want to differentiate between academia and then between your specific focus, and maybe we'll start off with what you found challenging with it. Okay,
so I think I'll just take the approach here of I pretty much succinctly put a PhD into 3 stages here. The first stage is the bumbling buffoon, which I think a lot of ENFPs fall into that category of people who are asking too many questions and people who always have an answer, even if they don't know the answer, right? And so this is stage 1 of the PhD. You're new into grad school. You've spent 4 years, in my opinion. ENFPs are fine socially. I struggled academically in undergrad a little bit. And I mean, from what I've seen, a lot of people struggle with, ENFPs struggle with being in the school setting and the learning and the academics aspect of it. But in a PhD, you start as this bumbling buffoon, and then you have to get to this level of knowledgeable idiot, is what I call it, right? What is a knowledgeable idiot? It's someone that knows the science and the literature, because all of your PhD is dependent on usually 3 things: papers, meetings with your committee, which are a group of professors, and we can get into that aspect after, and then knowing the literature, because every question they could ask is usually based off of something someone else has written. And this is exactly in the first 2 stages. I'm sure you've heard of impostor syndrome. Every PhD student has it. And this is exactly why I think it's hard for ENFPs in lab sciences, is because to get to the point of knowledgeable idiot, you have to force yourself into this bubble of sitting down and reading, right? And especially when you're an ENFP, you're like, oh, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do that, right? It's like, that's why we procrastinate, is because, as I like to call it, we are the masters of the rabbit hole. But if we can apply that rabbit hole to science, I think we do just fine, right? And so getting to the point where you're a knowledgeable idiot can be very, very tough if you're not dedicated, if you're not good at planning out your day, if you're not good at organizing and time managing, right?
Yeah.
And so this is one of the biggest things, is planning, organization, time management, multitasking, like getting results versus interpreting those results. And if you look at the weaknesses in the 16 personalities, right, is one of them may have poor practical skills, right? Which is all of those in one weakness, right? And
And a
so,
very kind way of saying it, though, may have poor practical skills.
yeah, a very kind way of saying it. I'd say that, like, I mean, at least for me, that was one of the biggest things was like, and I'm still working on it to this very day, is there's days where I hyper focus and there's days where it's a struggle. But all I know is that you have to get to the first two stages, because when someone says they have a PhD, what does that really mean? And this is what we're good at. But the problem here in this PhD is getting to it is, when someone says they have a PhD, you expect them to have the knowledge background scientifically and be able to combine ideas from different places to create a new novel scientific concept, right?
In a perfect world, I would assume that's the purpose. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that's what I've boiled it down to. We're great at connecting the dots. It's just we have to build the dedication and time management skills in order to get through the first two stages to be able to take advantage of our ENFP connect the dots ability, right?
Yeah. That's very interesting. Yeah, and that makes sense. So you need the foundation of all the different knowledge, which you're probably at times not very interested. Like one rabbit hole you'd love to spend a week on, but you should only dedicate 3 hours because you need to move to the next topic or
Yeah.
whatever else.
Yeah, and you could be reading papers and it's like, oh, go start reading papers. You'll start reading papers. You'll start looking at references at the bottom of the paper that are references to other papers. Then you read those papers. And I've found that I've rabbit holed plenty of times, but then you get 5 papers in and you're like, wait a minute, that's not the purpose of what I'm trying to read for. Right? So it'll be something related, but not directly applicable at the same time. So you have to have this depth of knowledge versus breadth of knowledge. And so in the PhD, you're supposed to have depth of knowledge versus breadth of knowledge.
Yeah. Which is not always what we love focusing on.
Yeah.
I've thought that's, it's always interesting in terms of the crap we have to shovel to get where we might be the best fit. Because now I'm not arguing that we go back to an age of nobility and being born into a job, but I'm going to make a little argument for it, because you have, like, I have this friend who's an ENTP, and you look up like perfect jobs for ENTPs, and they're things like venture capitalist, developer, like high level strategic thinking type stuff. But the problem is to get to that, like he was a lawyer. He's now I guess he's a dean, but he went down the professor route, but he was a lawyer. But in order to become a partner, you have to grind it out like 16 hours a day, which is not the same person who thinks strategically and builds, big projects or does venture investing. That's not about necessarily the 16 hours a day. It's about the clarity of thought and strategic thinking and analysis and everything. But there's not that many ways to get to those positions without grinding it out. So it's like we have this system now, because we have freedom of choice of whatever profession we want to do, that you kind of like work your way up, right? That whole thing. And I think it's the only fair way to do things now. But it creates a weird thing where I think a lot of people work their way up to maybe strategic positions, but they're not a strategic thinker, they're a grinder. Yeah. And so they work their way up by grinding it out, but they don't actually have the mind to really make those big picture decisions. And then the big picture people can't grind it out or don't want to grind it out, so they never get to the strategic positions.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So that's what I would say as well, is the big difference is, I always have this thought process is, if I were knowing what I know now, would I do a PhD again? And I mean, that's a hypothetical question. But there are times where I said, hey, I could have gone to business school for 2 years and skipped this 5.5, maybe 6-year process and just gone off and done something. Like when I'm thinking of what would be my ideal right now, is going into something where all the results are there, because the biggest part of a PhD and being in lab sciences is generating results for a novel idea, versus the way I see other jobs, say, for example, something like consulting, is all the information is there and you're only responsible for collecting it and then creating the new idea, right? Which is essentially the third part of the PhD.
Yeah.
and then you build knowledge of how to get that it's more building knowledge of how to get that information than it is necessarily like delving deep into literature, like textbooks about whatever it is, right? Though it won't hurt me. And I'm glad that I've done this PhD in the end. You know, it's just, it seems like there's a bunch of different careers out there where you could skip to the thing that connects ideas with the data that's already out there than trying to generate it yourself.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. You know, an upside to doing what you've done, and I think it's similar when ENFPs, let's say, have done an engineering degree or a finance degree or something, where yes, it's probably not the ideal fit, but it does help you develop skills and traits and behaviors that if you can then combine with the right fit later, you might have an insane edge over people.
Absolutely.
Where if at like, and who knows, we all have a different path in that, but if at 19 or 20, you went down a route that was perfectly aligned with you, you may not have developed some of that area of discipline, self-reflection, and everything else.
Yeah.
But
it'll definitely help me at the end of this. And I've definitely already seen signs of things, more organized ideas. And I'm glad that I have that, because I learned that at like about 2 years into the PhD. I'm like, I am not concise at all, first of all. And then second of all, I go into my professor and other professors and I present concepts and ideas in like a PowerPoint, and they go, this makes no sense whatsoever. I'm like, it makes perfectly complete good sense to me. In my head, everything makes sense. But then people see it and they're like, that's not logical. The flow is not logical. I don't understand why you have this idea here, that idea there. So there's a lot of things a lot of weaknesses that I've been able to work on that will be very useful to me moving forward for sure.
What are one of the things that I hear a lot from ENFPs is like wanting to develop organizational skills, the practical skills, as they were so nicely called. Do you have any tips for that? Like, what's helped you improve?
Okay, so the hardest part is starting something, right? It's procrastinating the starting. It's and usually if you have, this is the biggest thing. So this is a very difficult, it's still a difficult concept, and this is why I'm also reaching out. So if there's any other PhD ENFPs that's have this figured out, or it's got a good organization structure, I'd love to hear it. But setting fake goals for like dates, right? I know this is a big questionable one because people know that it's not the real deadline for something, right? And so they're gonna be like, I know it's not the real deadline, so why would I do it by that deadline? You have to set a deadline and you have to be really committed to that deadline. And that's very difficult. But what I find the most useful is I've got this notebook actually. Get S done, the S word done. And it says at the beginning, you'll appreciate this. There are two types of people in this world, the ones who simply talk and dream of success, and the ones who go out there, chase their dreams, and get shit done, right? And so I think it was one of your videos that talks about put up and shut up. What is that the name of the video?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
It's the one where you said, don't talk about what you're going to do it, and then tell people you've done it, right?
Yeah.
And I find that, especially there's a Reddit post, which people might find interesting. It's called Dancing with Fire, the ENFP's Guide to Finding Focus. I haven't gone through the actual links, and there's a link to a bunch of books, but it says that we're able to achieve this, and I've experienced this myself, the state of hyper-focus. What does it require? Working on something for 15 minutes, right? And there's the whole series of 25-minute timers with a 5-minute break in between.
Yeah.
I find that's useful because once you get started on something and you need to get to that level of hyper-focus, and people rely too much on putting themselves in a state. It's like, oh, I need to go sit in the library, or I need to do this, especially now. It's like, just sit down, work on it for 15 or 20 minutes. And if you're not in that hyper-focus zone, and then you take a 5-minute break and then keep doing that, and eventually you'll get into it. And also a higher level of that's very like basic day-to-day level. The the higher level is you're trying to find an emotional connection to what you do, right?
Yeah.
So the problem is if you're focusing on the scientific aspects, like my day-to-day is focusing on the specific details of how an amino acid can change, right? And it's very focused detail, but at the same time is you have to think about what the impact of your work is. Anything that gets you emotionally connected to what you do, which is also why your advisor is important, because they have to get you riled up to be emotionally involved. You have to force yourself to at least fake emotional involvement in order to generate this idea of, hey, I'm interested in this, right? You may not be interested in it, but you have to at least fake yourself out mentally.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a very good point. The flow aspect you mentioned in terms of sinking into that state is very, very true. And I find, so for me, I have certain things I do that basically guarantee I will get focused. So if I have a clear task, so I'm going to write an article, let's say, and I know what the topic is, and then it involves like headphones, certain types of music. I have a digitally imported .fm subscription I've had for probably a decade. So like trance music, chill hop, house, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, there's like 10 or 15 minutes that you have to go through. And then you sort of are like, oh, what happened to the last 2 hours?
Yeah.
But it's like, if I create that environment for myself, the work will get done. But you have to be disciplined enough to kind of sit down, have the focus, turn the music on in my case, and get into it.
Yeah. And so you have no idea how many times I've been listening to Spotify and all of a sudden I listen and I'm like, why is dubstep on, right? And I'm like, why am I listening to this is my personal opinion, but it's pretty bad. And so I'm like, wait a minute, there's dubstep on. And I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize that. But when it comes to the other thing, I'd say if people were to do one thing and one thing only, is try to plan 2 weeks, every single day, what you're going to do for 2 weeks. Because I found it, at least at the beginning, is when I don't know what tomorrow's going to do, how am I supposed to plan the next day, right?
Yeah.
And the whole idea is you're going to come up with a list of, especially if you're an ENFP, you're going to come up with a list of 10 things you think you need to do, right? And then as days go on, you realize what of the 10 things is actually useful, right? So planning 2 weeks in advance, if there's one thing to do, that's it. It's the hardest thing to do. It takes forever to learn how to do it. It takes forever to get yourself to be able to do it. But I'd say that's the most beneficial thing, just planning 2 weeks in advance.
And did I hear you right to do that every day? So kind of review what the 2 weeks is. So every day, on Tuesday, I plan 2 weeks, and Wednesday, I look at it again and kind of plan afresh?
Yeah. And then you change it based on what you did the previous day. Because the reason why you want to do it every day is because it'll help, like I said, it'll help you realize of the 10 things you wrote down, what's the most important thing. And also the big ENFP thing that I found is that we don't have a good sense of how long things are going to take. And so by doing it every day, you can write, and usually I would recommend writing it down immediately after you finished a part of it, is how long it took, because that'll give you some sort of idea how long things will take moving forward. You could say, okay, I thought it was going to take this long. It actually took 4 times as long. So the next time I plan on doing it, I need to plan for the entire length of time, right? And I found that's a good way of keeping track.
Yeah. It's funny, I've come to some of these same conclusions through basically the struggle of, when you're not getting things done, you really have to introspect and figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
And that. What else do you want to say? I know you prepared a bunch, so maybe I'll just give you a bit of a runway here in terms of your experience with your PhD.
Yeah.
Good or bad advice, whatever you want to share.
So when it comes to the 16 personalities list of weaknesses, which let me just start with this, because I find this to be very interesting, is MBTI. People are like, it's like a horoscope, right? It's not scientifically proven. Then what's the point of following it all? So the reason why I follow it is that it provides value, right? So there's decisions that could be scientifically true or not scientifically true, right? But in my opinion, MBTI has value. It tells you about yourself. It tells you about other people. One of the things I want to do is learn all 16 personality types because I think it'll help me interact with other people, right? And like you said in your videos of our strength is being able to read personality types, right? It's like they might not be the be all tell all, but my thought, like my dad says, if it explains 30% of people, that's pretty damn useful to begin with,
Yeah,
right?
that puts you in like the top 1% of people who understand others. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when people say it's not scientifically proven, I just say I think it's more valuable to have than to not have for that reason.
Yeah.
But I mean, to go more into the aspect of academia, that was kind of a tangent, but one of the weaknesses in this is highly emotional. And it says we're super sensitive to criticism, which I find to be completely true. So over the course of your PhD, right, you have data update meetings, yearly data update meetings in our cases until you get to your thesis. And so what this is a group of say 4 or 5 professors that come sit, they listen to your talk and they pretty much pick you apart. The problem is, at least my initial problem was when I guess I'm too honest, right? And as my grandfather always says, don't say negative about yourself because that only sets you up for failure. And what that means is I can be honest with myself, and theoretically the professors should be like, okay, you've acknowledged your weaknesses, but they usually tack on to what you've mentioned and dig, right? And so by the end of it, you're just emotionally just completely destroyed effectively, right?
So is it better? I mean, this is always kind of my guess with academia and a lot of areas of kind of larger organizations, is that you do better approaching it with an ego. I'm not saying necessarily as an ENFP, but that aspect of like believing you're important, talking yourself up, rather than go in with like a humble attitude or a more honest attitude.
So I'd say generally it's better that way, as long as you don't come off in a, pompous, arrogant sort of way. If you can frame that arrogance to be less ego driven and more truthful, I wish that we could be completely straight up and honest with people, but that's not the way people work. And this is, I'd say, another ENFP strength is we just, we can just go for it. And a lot of people say, oh, wow, you're very confident. I'm like, well, is that how I come off? Okay, fine, then good. We can use that to our advantage, but definitely never talk ill of yourself because that only sets people up. The nature of humans is to take that ill and to dig even further, to take it to like criticize you, right? Yeah. And so
academia is quite competitive, right? The people kind of want to take each other down to some level.
So I'd say there's gradations. Like there's a lot of people with big egos, and a lot of big professors can have big egos, and it doesn't help that no one's managing them. And so this is the biggest difference between industry and academia, is since no one's managing the professors, which is when a professor gets tenure, they can do whatever they want. They can tell their students what to do, whatever they want them to do, right? And so the biggest struggle that I found is not between students, right? Because people who struggle together usually develop bonds together. And every lab setting I've been in is been fairly non-competitive. And usually when people are competitive, I just mess with them more than anything else, because I wouldn't consider myself a competitive person, right? This is life. I'm trying to figure out what my weaknesses are and work on my weaknesses before I try to worry about someone else's weaknesses. So when I find competitive people, right, they might get me riled up, but I'm like, okay, you do whatever you want, you think whatever you want, fine. But generally, PhD students are all tied together in the same boat. A lot of people are going through the same thing. So between the students, I wouldn't find it that competitive. It's more the professors driving the culture of academia.
Yeah. Okay. So after the degree, if you were to move on to be a professor or something like that.
That's an option. And because our degree is very industry related, there's a lot of people that do not become professors. And I'm of the viewpoint of, I'd like to meet a professor that gives me a good enough opinion to make me want to become a professor, Or you have the typical, well, if I want to change the system, I need to be part of the change, so therefore I should become a professor type of mentality. But I'm personally not staying in academia. There's no way I could do it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. What else do you want to add?
Okay, so we're going to add a little TLDR here of, as an ENFP, should you go into a PhD in lab sciences, is if you're willing to go through this, I mean, I think that everyone should be willing to work on their weaknesses, but at the same time, I've always had this question of work on weaknesses or work on strengths, right? And sometimes, and this is more of a tangential idea, but I find that our biggest strengths can be our biggest weaknesses at the same time. That's just a whole nother thought. I don't think we should go into that right now, but as an ENFP, your biggest struggles will be the bare essentials and bare necessities of a personality, right? Of your personality type. If you have poor practical skills, it's going to be a struggle. If you're highly emotional, and it's going to be a struggle. If you overthink things, I mean, I'm just going to go through the weaknesses list. If you overthink things, I get emails constantly from people, and I try to analyze what they're saying at a deeper level. And I get stressed out very easily. That's another one, right? Find it difficult to focus. You're stuck in the system of that's driven by professors. And so as much as I would like to say you shouldn't do it, if you want to do it, the biggest part are interviews. When you're in interviews, you get to meet the professors that you might want to work with. And in my opinion, your advisor is the key to whether you should do a PhD or not. And so there's a few different ideas of what professor you're looking for. The first idea is, I guess it ties into experience and how long they've been in academia, for the fact that you want someone that when they make an executive decision for you, that's beyond your scope of knowledge, you could say, hey, excuse me, why did you make that decision, right? And they have no problem expressing why they made that decision. So, but if you have, say, someone who doesn't have experience or hasn't been in academia that long, and typically, say, professors that are going into academia have this problem, is you try to ask them why they've done something a certain way, and either they get defensive, which is not what you want at all, because, you know, we're communicators. We like asking questions. Why did you do this? What was the mentality behind making this decision? Is there a better or different way of doing it? And if your professor's going to get defensive about it, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble and you're not going to be able to ask any questions. And so the saving grace for someone that does want to do a PhD and might not be with the right advisor is always be looking for mentors. I mean, that's why I reached out to you, right? Is like, because I know that you've got a lot of advice to give. And I tell people this: your professor is not necessarily your advisor. You need to go find someone you can connect with who can give you good ideas and connect with you on a personal level, right? And so it's rough, and it takes a lot of interchange that can be beneficial. But I'm not going to say that if you find connection to something like business oriented, that's like a third of the time, 2 years versus 5 years. The reason why I went into PhD versus an MD or a PharmD, which are these professional schools, is a PhD is paid for. And these other degrees, you have to pay $30,000, $40,000, up to $40,000 a year to go to 4 years of school, right?
Good old America.
I know, right? And so it's always a question of balancing. I'd say that it's hard for an ENFP, but I'd say given the right advisor, the right mentors, and if you want to build on skills that you don't have, I think it's a great time. I just think that there's also a lot of problems, or I wouldn't call them problems. I'd say there's a lot of barriers that have to be overcome.
Yeah.
Right.
So if someone's passionate about the topic or very interested in it, maybe passionate is not always the right word, and they see an outcome, like it makes sense to them, hey, I want to do this PhD because I want to do this, that they can make it work, but being very very particular about maybe the professor you pick to work with and how you approach it. And I guess even choosing the school would have a big impact, because different schools would have different headspaces in terms of like cultures and everything.
Yeah. So the professors create the cultures, and every professor, like everyone else, everyone's different, right? And so different schools have different cultures and different professors. And that's what the key of interviews are at this point. But I'd say that the exception to the rule is if someone who cares about science, right? If there's an ENFP who cares about, I mean, this is theoretical, I'm not implementing whether or not I fall into this, is an ENFP that cares about the science and is motivated by the science and impact the science can have, I don't think it's going to have a problem no matter who their advisor is, right? Mm. It's because I think an ENFP can do well. Like I said before, we're good at going down rabbit holes. If someone who really enjoys it goes down a lot of rabbit holes, then I don't think that they're going to have a problem regardless.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I'm glad we've talked as well, because there's a lot of misconceptions about ENFPs. And one, I think, is about math and sciences. And there's an assumption, people do this a lot where they generalize with type. So they'll be an ENFP and they're really bad at math or technology, and they know one other who is, and they just assume like ENFPs are bad at math or sciences or programming, which is completely not the case. I was like doing math contests as a kid and love technology and stuff. And it's not uncommon. I have a client who's a scientist and a chemist, and it's just our type, it impacts different parts about us in terms of how maybe we interact with what we're interested in and can succeed in the environment. But math, science, all that is very open for ENFPs. Unfortunately, the environments are often not the best. The subjects are very interesting to us and great, but sometimes maybe the academia, the organizations, the businesses are not created for ENFPs, let's say.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's curious, is your client a master's level or PhD level?
I don't know, actually. He's a bit older, so he has a company where they do private label cosmetics.
Yeah.
Based on, I guess he does the formulas and everyththing.
Sure.
So I don't know what his education is. I assume master's, just off the top of my head. Sure. But ENFPs aren't much to tap the or tag the doctor to the start of their name, even if they have a PhD, because it might. So.
Yeah. So the other thing I guess I want to add here on that, which is the reason why I asked about it, is if you're going to do a master's in lab sciences versus a PhD in lab sciences, from my view of industry, PhD in lab sciences are the ones who connect the dots. So when they go to industry, usually they have the master students working as the lab technicians, right? And they're the people that have to do that. They have to do the lab experiments endlessly over and over and over again. And I think one of the girls I worked with in my internship was an ENFP master's, and she's like absolutely suffering from the rope repetition, no higher level of thinking, versus the PhDs have to do the higher level of thinking.
So it's worth putting in the extra years to then skip decades of grunt work.
Yeah. If you're going to go into lab sciences at this current time, I wouldn't do a master's as an ENFP.
Nice. Anything else you want to add?
Accountability. I got this line from what's it called? Did you ever watch the YouTube channel called How to ADHD?
Yeah, I like her stuff.
I can't tell it. What is she? Is she an ENFP?
I don't know, and I'm terrible actually, or at least below what I should be at typing people.
Yeah.
And then it gets tough when it's on YouTube, because you see like 6 minutes of someone's life and they're kind of controlling how they present themselves and scripted stuff.
Yeah, especially for YouTube, that's definitely what they have to do. And so she came up, I don't know if this is where this is from, but her line was, you got to have an accountability buddy, right? Which is a great term. And what I realized, especially leading organizations in the past, right? You create a club, for example, and you don't follow through after a semester or two, right?
Yeah.
You need to find someone that can hold you accountable, who's like an introvert, right? One of the people I sit next to in the office is an introvert type, defender type. And I'm like, if you see me slacking off, you tell me that I'm slacking off, right? So you need to find someone who has the strengths that you don't have to help you and to be your accountable, like, hey, you should work on this, right? Someone who can be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And yeah, good piece of advice. Would you say you have ADHD as well? You mentioned that channel. I mean, it's America, so I assume everyone's on Ritalin anyhow. So then it's hard to tell. I'm just kidding, but
I don't know. I've never been diagnosed. I wouldn't be surprised. And so this is another one of my thoughts of, do all ENFPs have ADHD, or all ADHD people are ENFPs? You know, one of those thoughts.
As far as I know, it's different. I actually have an older video on this. I think it's just called like ADHD or ENFP. And yeah, they're different, but a lot of the, like you mentioned earlier, hyperfocus, and that's very much an ADHD trait. And maybe ENFP as well. And a lot of people, I mean, it's not an uncommon thing to get into, I guess. But yeah, sometimes, you know, you might have someone who's a really balanced personality type, but then they have ADHD. So then they might seem more like an ENFP. And the way I think about it now, it would be interesting to research it more and sort of get into the weeds. But ENFP is more bigger picture in terms of, say, changing direction. So ADHD is like short term. Are you scattered? Are you changing direction like within the day? And the ENFP aspect tends to be like larger, looking at life. You know, do you change jobs every year or 6 months or things like that, as one of the more maybe negative traits. But that kind of applies to both. So it's tough. I don't have a clear answer on it. And I think a lot of the tools, for instance, on the How to ADHD channel, are helpful for anyone with like borderline issues with attention and focus. Yeah. You know, a lot of what is talked about. I do think ADHD is a very specific wiring. It's not like everyone's a little ADHD or that. I hate that way of thinking. Yeah. But some of the tools that help with ADHD help with, even if you don't have it, I think, with focus and organization and how to think and plan and all that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else I was thinking of? I don't know. Do you have any other questions?
I'll say we'll leave it there, but I'm guessing, so I'll post this on YouTube and as a podcast. And I'm guessing in the podcast, unfortunately, we can't get comments, but I'm guessing the comments on YouTube, people will have questions. And so maybe we do a follow-up, or maybe if you are, I'll send you a link when it's published. You can answer in the comments, share any feedback or your thoughts there. Yeah, I think you've shared a ton of wisdom here. It's going to be really helpful for people.
Well, hopefully it's anything wise. I mean, it's just thoughts. The one thing I want to do is I want to read more, and I want to be like, I mean, because a lot of thoughts, you know, especially now, is someone must have thought about whatever I'm thinking about before me. And so I just don't have the grasp of knowledge to be able to cite different sources for these ideas, but I'm sure someone has. I
was going to say given up on citing. I never really even started to care about citing because I realized, which obviously I would not do well in academia. But there is a lot of the time this happens with entrepreneurs, with comedians, with like, I think even was it the theory of evolution that someone else came up with it almost at the same time in a completely unrelated. It might have been a different theory, but there's a lot of times in history where two scientists have come up with very similar theories and they've never had a connection to each other. Yeah. Because it's like, if you have similar minds with a similar base of knowledge as the world progresses, it's only natural you'll come to the same conclusion, especially if it's the correct conclusion.
Sure. Yeah.
And it's, you know, and I think that happens a lot in the coaching world as well and stuff. Like I'll read someone else's blogs or that, and I'll be like, oh, they're saying what I was saying last month. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure it's not a direct copy. It's just like, and then I'll read something they wrote before I wrote it. And I'm like, okay, I know I didn't copy them, but we said the same thing.
Yeah.
And, just how it is. But with citing stuff, I've realized for myself, this kind of comes to working in your strengths and then just being very self-accepting, which you can do when you're on your own, is I'm just like, I'm not going to cite things. So when I'm talking in videos and I talk about studies, I've never had anyone call me out on them being inaccurate. Like, oh no, I looked that up, it's wrong. But I'm remembering things from a book I read 5 years ago. And I'm like, I'm not going to go and spend 2 hours to go through that book, or I'm never going to publish a YouTube video. So you can take it as it is. And, if you want, verify it or whatever. But
and that's the thing that, like I mentioned, the documentation, right? Is you read these journal articles and you got to sort them and you got to write like what it was talking about. Because eventually you have all these ideas floating around your head and you say them, they're like, where is that from? I'm like, I don't know, I read it somewhere.
Yeah. Oh no, that would drive me nuts having to sort it. I think many positions, including maybe PhDs, would work very well in partnerships. Like if you partnered someone who's more creative and great at taking all that information, working it together with someone who loves organizing and sorting, and more like, I think ISTJs are all about like preserving history and organizing and things like that. And
I think that's the defender type.
That
ISTJ.
Yeah, I don't always remember how 16 Personality has named them, but I think it is. Yeah. So, you combine them. ENFPs are like forward looking, and we don't really want to look in the past, and ISTJs kind of live in the past. So it's a great combination to do it. You could do 3 PhDs together with 2 people, easier than 2 separately, probably.
Yeah, it's like one of my best friends in the lab, and she's graduated and moved to Andover, Massachusetts. She was helping me scientifically, and I was helping her with she's Korean, so I was helping her with her English, and we'd go to conferences and we'd just be schmoozing with people, right? And I was helping her learn how to network, and she was helping me scientifically, sort of that kind of commensal? I think it's called commensal relationship.
Your vocabulary is better than mine, so I'm going to assume
Or is it
yes.
when one person? No, it's mutual. It's a mutual. Yeah. Commensals, I think, when one person benefits and the other one is neutral.
Okay. Nice. For anyone watching, if you're interested, well, first off, in the comments, let us know if you've enjoyed this, what your takeaways were. Say nice things, or I'll mute you from the channel. I am a dictator. That's fine. Any questions you have for Alex, let him know. And if you are interested in doing some interview like this, I think you've set a high standard, Alex. So you might have scared people off here, but if you
Don't be scared, people. You got this. I'm just talking off the top of my head. These are just free-flowing thoughts, and everyone's got different thoughts, and we can learn from everyone. Everyone is unique, and everyone is
No. You're going to get me in hell. If you say everyone's thoughts are important, do you know the people I'm going to have to interview? We need to have a bar of standard. I only have so much time.
I didn't say they're all appropriate. I'm just saying, you're not responsible for the thoughts that come into your head. You're only responsible for what comes out of your mouth.
That's fair. If you are interested in sharing your story or doing some kind of interview like this, then send me an email, only an email. That's kind of my basic barrier to entry test. If you can't figure out how to email me, then we won't do an interview. And I'll get back to you, and that could be fun. And I don't know, any final thoughts?
Nope, no final thoughts. I mean, I have a lot of different questions about ENFPs and thoughts about ENFPs and the relationships to different things, but not for this video.
Yeah, and I have your email. I think we were actually talking on Instagram, but I have your email now from setting this up. So
now it was all over email.
Oh, so you set up this? Did you set this up with a different email? Who knows? Doesn't matter. Cool. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you, everyone, for watching.